My name is Elara Vance, and if you are listening to this, it means the dust has finally settled. As a senior forensic auditor, my life is lived in the aftermath. I don't see the ribbon cuttings. I don't drink the champagne at the launch parties. I am the person who walks through the ruins of a collapsed dream to find the exact point where the structural integrity failed. I spend my days in silence, surrounded by boxes of receipts that smell like stale coffee and fear. I track the ghostly footprints of money as it moves from legitimate accounts to shell companies, from shell companies to offshore havens, and finally, into the pockets of men who smile too much. Usually, people think they want the truth. They clamor for it. They demand transparency. But they don't. Not really. The truth is cold. It's mathematical. It's a spreadsheet that doesn't balance by 3 cents. No, they want a villain they can recognize, a thief, a liar, a cheat. They want someone to hate, so they don't have to look at their own signatures on the bottom of the contracts. They want a monster, so they can feel like heroes for simply surviving. Before we dive deeper into the mechanics of the Miller-Sloane expansion, I must ask you to support the work we do here at Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. This channel is an archive of mistakes. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications. In the world of high-stakes deception, the most important details are often hidden in plain sight, and I don't want you to miss a single entry in this ledger of human frailty. This is a long account because betrayal of this magnitude is not an event, it is a process. It is a slow, methodical erosion that looks like progress until the day the ground gives way. It starts with a handshake, then a compromise, then a lie, and finally, a collapse. The anatomy of the Oakhaven project. To understand the bridge, you must understand the silence it was built to break. In 2018, Oakhaven was a town holding its breath. The air tasted of salt and iron oxide. I remember my first drive into town. The coastal highway was slick with mist, and the road signs were bleached by the sun, their letters peeling like old skin. The town emerged from the fog like a shipwreck. The fishing industry was a memory, a ghost story told in empty pubs where the beer was cheap and the hope was expensive. The local textile mill had been replaced by a sprawling, empty warehouse that sat on the edge of town like a tombstone. The windows were shattered, looking like jagged teeth against the gray sky. The $400 million bypass bridge wasn't just a construction project, it was a secular prayer. It was meant to connect our crumbling docks to the Silicon Basin 30 miles inland. It was a desperate grasp at relevance. The town council sold it as a lifeline, a blood transfusion for a dying patient. When I arrived, I met Sarah Miller. She was the senior architect and project manager. Sarah didn't have hobbies. She didn't have a family photo on her desk. She had a singular, monomaniacal focus on the physics of tension and compression. Her office smelled of ozone and graphite. The walls were covered in schematics, a chaotic wallpaper of white lines on blue paper. I watched her inspect a rivet once. She stared at it for 10 minutes, touching it like it was a religious artifact. She wore gray suits that matched the concrete she championed. She once spent 4 hours explaining to the city council why a specific grade of Swedish steel was superior to the domestic alternative despite the 20% price hike. She stood before them, a PowerPoint presentation reflecting in her glasses, and dismantled their budget concerns with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply laid out the failure rates of the cheaper steel, calculating the probability of catastrophic collapse down to the decimal point. She won because her logic was an iron cage. There was no way to argue with it without looking like a fool or a spendthrift. Her partner, Julian Sloane, was the Sloane of Miller-Sloane. But he didn't draw. He didn't calculate. He was a master of the soft sciences, lobbying, optics, and sentiment. He wore suits that cost more than the dock workers made in a year, but he wore them with an ease that made you forgive him. He drove a vintage Jaguar that purred like a contented cat. He was the one who bought the first round of drinks at the pub for the displaced dock workers. He was the one who remembered the name of the mayor's secretary's cat. He was the one who could walk into a room of angry union reps and walk out with a signed agreement and a dinner invitation. I saw him once at a gala slip a gold watch to a union foreman. It wasn't a bribe, he would say. It was a token of appreciation. But the watch was worth more than the foreman's car. Together, they were considered the gold standard. One provided the bones, the other provided the skin. It was a marriage of necessity, a perfect balance of force and friction. Or so it seemed. But in my line of work, we know that the brightest facades often hide the deepest cracks, and Oakhaven was about to break. The first discrepancy. My audit began in a temporary trailer on the north bank of the river. It was a metal box, baking in the summer sun, smelling of heated plastic and cheap adhesive. The floor was always covered in a fine layer of grit from the cement mixers that roared outside like dying beasts. I spent 16 hours a day there, trapped in a vibrating cage of noise. My only companions were the flies that buzzed against the window and the stacks of invoices that threatened to topple over and bury me. I developed a routine. Coffee at 6 a.m., black, bitter as regret, reviewing labor logs until noon. Lunch was a sandwich eaten over a trash can so crumbs wouldn't fall on the ledgers. Then the real work began, comparing the digital promises to the physical reality. Sarah Miller was, on paper, a dream for an auditor. Her filings were immaculate. If she spent $12 on a box of nails, there was a receipt, a photo of the box, and a log of which carpenter used them. She documented everything with a terrifying precision. It was almost aggressive, this transparency. It was as if she was daring me to find a flaw. But perfection is often a mask. 3 months in, I found a ghost. It wasn't in the steel or the concrete. It was in the dirt. I found a recurring payment to a firm called Vista Land Management. They had been paid a total of $2.4 million over 18 months for environmental surveying and mitigation. In my experience, environmental mitigation is a common place to hide kickbacks. It's vague. It involves moving earth, planting trees, consulting on soil stability. It's hard to audit mud. I pulled the file. The invoices were generic, service rendered, phase 1 analysis. No dates of service, no itemized breakdown, just a round number, $150,000 every month, like rent. I decided to verify Vista Land Management. I looked up their registered address. It wasn't a lab or an office park. It was a P.O. box in a strip mall 3 towns over. I got into my car. The air conditioning was broken, blowing hot dust into my face. I took the coastal highway south. The asphalt was cracked, veins of tar running through the gray surface. I passed towns that looked like they were fading in the sun. Gas stations with boarded-up windows, diners with for lease signs. This was the America the bridge was supposed to save. I turned off the highway into a town called Solitude, a fitting name. The strip mall was a sad L shape of beige stucco. The Vista address was nestled between a dry cleaner and a payday loan shop. The dry cleaner had a sign that said, "We clean anything," but the A was missing, so it just said, "We clean anything." A man walked out of the payday loan shop counting a stack of cash, looking over his shoulder. I parked and walked to the wall of P.O. boxes. Box 402. I peered through the little glass window. It was stuffed. Blue envelopes, a flyer for a pizza place, a jury duty summons. There was no Vista land management. There was no team of soil scientists analyzing the pH balance of the riverbed. There was just an empty metal box collecting checks that were undoubtedly being forwarded to an offshore account. I felt that familiar coldness in my stomach, the thrill of the hunt mixed with the nausea of betrayal. I stood there for a moment, watching the heat radiate off the pavement. This is what corruption looks like. It's not a smoky backroom, it's a P.O. box next to a dry cleaner. I drove back to the site, the invoice burning a hole in my passenger seat. I rehearsed the conversation in my head. I would be firm. I would be undeniable. I went straight to Sarah. I found her in her office, a real office, with air conditioning and a view of the river. She was reviewing blueprints, her finger tracing a load-bearing wall. I placed the invoice on top of her drawings. "Who is Vista Land Management?" I asked. Sarah didn't blink. She didn't look up. She moved the invoice aside as if it were a coaster. "That's Julian's department," she said, her voice flat. "He handles the environmental compliance." "Sarah," I leaned in. "I drove to their office. It's a P.O. box. There is no staff. There is no equipment. We have paid them $2.4 million for soil analysis that never happened." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were clear, unclouded with guilt. They were the eyes of a statue. "I build the bridge, Elara," she said. "Julian handles the soil and the people. If the bill is paid, the soil is ready. That is the division of labor." "It's fraud," I whispered. "It's necessary," she countered, standing up and walking to the window. "Do you know how long it takes to get a wetland permit in this state, Elara? 2 years. 2 years of waiting while the steel rusts in the yard. Unless you know the county clerk's birthday, unless you hire the right consultant to smooth the paperwork." She turned back to me. "Julian removes the friction. I don't ask how, I just watch the bridge go up." I watched her through the trailer window later that day. She was standing on a pier, staring at a pylon. She didn't look like a woman who was stealing. She looked like a woman who was praying to a god made of concrete. She had accepted the corruption as part of the cost of materials. To her, a bribe was no different than a bag of cement, just another resource needed to get the job done. But cement hardens, corruption rots, and the rot was already in the foundation. While Sarah Miller was a ghost haunting the steel beams, Julian Sloane was a god walking among the mortals. He didn't just manage the project, he was the project. He was in the local paper every week, his smile bright enough to bleach the newsprint. He organized the Bridge to the Future scholarship for Oakhaven high schoolers. I watched him at the high school auditorium one rainy Tuesday. He stood on stage, handing a giant check to a weeping girl named Samantha. Samantha was the daughter of a crab fisherman who had lost his boat to the bank the year before. She had been working 2 jobs to save for college. Julian held her hand with both of his, looking into her eyes like she was the only person in the room. "This bridge isn't for cars," he told the crowd, his voice booming without a microphone. "It's for Samantha. It's so she can go to Stanford and come back and save us all." The room erupted. Men who had lost their pensions cheered for him. Women who were struggling to buy groceries baked him pies. He convinced the town that the inconvenience of the construction, the noise that rattled their windows, the dust that coated their cars, the blocked roads that doubled their commutes, was not a nuisance, it was a tithe, a small price to pay for the rebirth of their community. He made the suffering feel noble. 6 months into the audit, he invited me to dinner. "You're working too hard, Elara," he said, leaning against my trailer door, wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than my car. "Come up to the house. Elena's making risotto." I shouldn't have gone. Auditors don't break bread with the subjects of their investigation. It compromises objectivity. But I went. I told myself it was for the job, to see how he lived, to see where the money might be going. But the truth is, I wanted to get out of that metal box. I drove up the winding road to the cliffs overlooking the ocean. Julian's house was a masterpiece of mid-century modern architecture. It was glass and steel, cantilevered over the edge of the cliff like a diver poised to jump. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. Inside, the air smelled of expensive wine and wood smoke. The walls were hung with abstract expressionist paintings, bold slashes of red and black that looked like violent wounds. His wife, Elena, was a cellist with the State Symphony. She was playing Bach in the living room when I arrived, the deep, mournful notes echoing off the glass walls. She was elegant, thin, and brittle, like a porcelain cup that might shatter if you held it too tight. She greeted me with a cold handshake. Her fingers were ice. "Julian tells me you're the woman who counts the nails," she said, her voice sharp. "Someone has to," I replied. "Someone has to make sure the house doesn't fall down." She looked at Julian, her eyes narrowing. "Some houses are built to fall, Miss Vance. It's the insurance money that matters." Julian laughed a little too loud and guided us to the terrace. We ate, watching the sunset behind the skeleton of the half-finished bridge below. Julian poured a vintage Pinot Noir. "Look at it," he said, gesturing to the construction site with his glass. "Sarah sees a structure. I see a nervous system. I see the connections between people." He spoke about Sarah with a mix of reverence and pity. "She's a genius, Elara," he whispered, "but she has no soul. She thinks people are variables in an equation. She'd pave over a playground if the geometry demanded it. I'm the one who makes sure the playground gets moved to a better spot. I'm the one who buys the new slide. I'm the one who makes the bridge human." He leaned in closer to me. The smell of his cologne, sandalwood, and money was overpowering. "You know, Elara, we could use someone like you on the permanent team, not just auditing, strategy. There's a future here for you, a future where you don't have to work in a tin can." It was a bribe, wrapped in a compliment, dipped in wine, but a bribe nonetheless. I looked at him. He was handsome, charismatic, and warm. He made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. I felt a pull toward him. We all did. It was a gravity stronger than the Earth's. But as I watched him swirl his wine, I noticed something. He never looked at the bridge. He only looked at the reflection of the bridge in the glass. He didn't love the thing itself. He loved what it made him look like. He loved the idea of being the savior. Elena dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against the china. We both looked at her. "Stop it, Julian," she whispered. "She's not one of your town councilors. You can't charm her into forgetting she has eyes." Julian's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Elena is tired," he said smoothly. "The cello takes a lot out of her." As Elena played a final dying note on her cello later that night, I realized that Julian Sloane wasn't building a bridge to the future. He was building a monument to himself, and he didn't care who he had to bury in the foundation, his wife, the town, or me, to get it done. The first real crack appeared, not in the bridge, but in the social fabric of Oakhaven. It started with a stone. A local contractor, Pete Russo, had been hired for the decorative masonry on the bridge's pedestrian walkway. Pete was Oakhaven royalty. His grandfather had built the town hall, the library, and the church. Pete was a giant of a man, with hands like shovels and a laugh that shook the dust off the rafters. He had bid low on the project, almost at cost, because he wanted his family's mark on the bridge. He wanted his children to walk across it and say, "Daddy built this wall." He was using Oakhaven granite, a local stone quarried just 5 miles up the coast. It was beautiful, a deep gray with veins of quartz that caught the light like trapped lightning. Sarah fired him on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. I was there. I was auditing the payroll in the site office when I saw the commotion on the monitors. I put on my hard hat and walked out onto the bridge deck.
The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the dust into a gray slurry. Sarah stood in the middle of the walkway, a laser level in one hand and a spectrometer in the other. Pete stood opposite her, flanked by his crew, 20 local fathers who had known each other since kindergarten. "It's granite, Sarah," Pete was shouting, his voice cracking with frustration. "It's the same stone that's held up the town hall for 80 years. Sarah didn't shout. She looked at her device. "The porosity is 0.4% too high, Mr. Russo," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "Oakhaven granite absorbs moisture. In a freeze-thaw cycle, it will crack. It might last 50 years, but this bridge is designed for 100. 50 years? Pete laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Who cares?" "I care," Sarah said. "The bridge cares." She fired him on the spot. She didn't care about his legacy. She didn't care that he was the biggest employer in town. She replaced him with a specialized firm from Vermont that used a synthetic composite. The town turned on her overnight. The local paper ran a headline, "Miller rejects Oakhaven heart." There were protests at the gate, men holding signs that said, "Local stone for local people," and "Go back to the city." Sarah became the villain. She walked through the crowds like they were ghosts, her eyes fixed on the horizon, completely unmoved by their hatred. But Julian saw an opportunity. He called an emergency town hall meeting. The gymnasium was packed. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and anger. Julian took the microphone. He didn't defend Sarah. He didn't talk about porosity or freeze-thaw cycles. "I hear you," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphone amplified to a roar. "I know Pete. I know his work, and I know that this bridge belongs to you." He paused, letting the applause wash over him. "Sarah is rigid," he admitted, playing the role of the weary partner. "But I have found a solution." He announced that while the bridge walkway required the synthetic stone, he had fought to hire Pete's crew for the access roadwork, the complex network of access ramps, drainage systems, and retaining walls that led to the bridge. "We need Oakhaven's strength to hold up the earth itself," he shouted. The crowd went wild. Pete Russo shook Julian's hand on stage, tears in his eyes. Julian became a hero. He had saved the jobs. He had honored the local stone. Later that night, I went to the Rusty Anchor, the pub near the docks. Pete was there, buying rounds for the whole bar. He was celebrating his victory. I walked up to him. "Pete," I said, "you don't do drainage work. You're a mason. The soil stability on those access roads is a nightmare." He looked at me, his eyes glazed with whiskey and pride. "We can handle it, Elara," he said. "It's just dirt. We've been moving dirt in this town for a century. Julian trusts us. Why don't you?" "It's not about trust. It's about physics. If those retaining walls fail, the road collapses." "Go back to your calculator," someone shouted from the back of the bar. "Let the men work." I left. I watched them work over the next few months. It was a disaster. They poured concrete in the rain. They skipped the rebar reinforcement in the retaining walls to save time. They used the wrong grade of gravel for the drainage beds. I saw it all. I documented it all. And every time I brought it to Julian, he'd just smile and sign the invoice. "They're learning, Elara," he'd say. "Give them dignity." But gravity doesn't care about dignity, and water doesn't care about pride. And Sarah? I found her late that night in the site office, working alone. The protest signs were still littering the ground outside. "You know what he did. You know Pete can't handle the drainage specs." Sarah didn't look up from her blueprints. "The bridge is safe, Elara," she said. "The walkway will last 100 years. But the roads won't. The roads will wash away in the first big storm." She finally looked at me. "Then they will have to build new ones. But the bridge will stand." She had sacrificed the town to save her masterpiece. She let Julian buy his popularity with their future as long as he kept his hands off her steel. It was a deal with the devil, signed in Oakhaven granite.
By year 3, the bridge was 80% complete. It rose from the water like a spine of white concrete, a masterpiece of cantilevered grace that caught the morning sun and held it. But while the bridge was ascending, the town below was sinking. My audit had found a cancer. It started with that first discrepancy, the Vista land management payments, but it had metastasized. I spent 3 weeks living inside the financial server. I didn't sleep. I ate vending machine crackers and drank lukewarm water. The trailer became a cell. I was using a forensic tracing algorithm that looked for recurring numerical patterns, the fingerprint of a lazy thief. And Julian was lazy. He used the same transfer amounts down to the cent every month. I followed the digital breadcrumbs of the $2.4 million. It had moved from the P.O. box in Solitude to a shell company in Delaware called Blue Horizon Holdings. From there, it went to a holding firm in Panama, and finally, it vanished into a private bank in the Cayman Islands called Emerald Capital, a dead end. Or so I thought. But money always leaves a scent. I found a metadata tag on one of the Cayman transfer receipts. It was a forwarded email attachment. I decrypted the header. It was an invoice from a contractor in Colorado, Aspen Luxury Renovations. I pulled up their website. High-end residential work, marble, teak, gold leaf. I cross-referenced Julian Sloane's assets. He owned a ski lodge in Aspen. I found the county permit filings. He wasn't just fixing a roof. He was installing heated marble floors, a temperature-controlled wine cellar, and a deck made of imported Brazilian teak. I sat there in my rusted trailer swatting flies, looking at photos of Brazilian teak. The cost of that deck alone was equal to the budget for the drainage system Pete Russo was currently botching on the access road. Julian was paving his vacation home with the safety of Oakhaven. He was trading the town's foundation for underfloor heating. It was a classic graft. Julian was the thief. He was using the project as a personal ATM, buying the town's silence with grace and local jobs while he picked their pockets. I printed the files, a stack of paper 3 inches thick. I felt a righteous fury burning in my chest. This was it. This was the smoking gun. I was going to take Julian down, and I was going to save Sarah Miller from her parasitic partner. I went to Sarah's office. It was raining again. It always seemed to be raining in Oakhaven, as if the sky was trying to wash the town clean. Sarah was at her drafting table, illuminated by a single lamp. She was surrounded by architectural models, tiny, perfect cities made of balsa wood where nothing ever rotted. She looked exhausted, her skin pale, her eyes rimmed with red. "I have him, Sarah," I said, slamming the file onto her desk. "I have the proof, the offshore accounts, the ski lodge, everything." Sarah looked at the file, then at me. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look relieved. She looked resigned. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a black binder. She slid it across the desk to me. "I know," she said. I opened the binder. It was everything I had just found, and more. She had bank transfer numbers I hadn't been able to decrypt. She had dates, times, amounts. She had known about Julian's Vista account for 2 years. She had been tracking it with more detail than I had. "You knew?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "You knew he was stealing millions? You knew he was compromising the access roads to pay for his ski lodge?" "Yes," she said. "Why haven't you reported him? Why aren't the police here? I'm going to the press, Sarah. I'm going to the governor." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bridge. "Go ahead," she said, softly. "Go to the press and watch what happens." She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "Do you know how many times this bridge has failed, Elara? In 1990, it died in committee. In 2005, it lost funding. Julian is the only reason it exists. He bribed the committee. He charmed the governor. He stole from the roads to pay the steel mill.
If I expose him now, the project is halted, the state pulls the funding, the investigation takes 5 years, the bridge sits half-finished, a skeleton in the fog, a monument to a scandal. It will never be completed. People could die, Sarah, I argued. The roads are crumbling. The drainage is a joke. The roads are not the bridge, she snapped. The bridge is perfect. The bridge will stand for a century. The roads, the town, they are variable. They are temporary. But the bridge is eternal. I looked at her and I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain. I thought Julian was the villain. I thought he was the monster. But Julian was just a greedy man. Sarah was a zealot. She was willing to burn the world down as long as her monument remained unsinged. I thought that was the betrayal. I thought she was a woman so obsessed with her art that she would allow a criminal to thrive if it meant her masterpiece was completed. I judged her for it. I hated her for it. But I didn't know then that her plan was far darker and far more complete than mere silence.
The bridge opened on a crisp morning in 2021. After 3 years of mud, noise, and deception, nature finally decided to cooperate. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue. The bridge itself was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, a silver ribbon spanning the gray Atlantic, its cables humming in the wind like the strings of a giant harp. It didn't look like a construction project. It looked like it had grown there, perfect and inevitable. The town of Oakhaven turned out in force. They wore their Sunday best. The high school marching band was there, their brass instruments gleaming, playing a slightly out-of-tune version of Fanfare for the Common Man. There were hot dog stands, balloons, and a palpable sense of relief. They believed the bridge was their salvation. They believed the hard times were over. Julian Sloane stood on the dais, a wooden platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting. He wore a navy suit that fit him like a second skin. He looked like a president. He looked like a king. He leaned into the microphone, flashing that smile that had charmed $3 million out of the state budget. "Today," he boomed, "we do not just open a bridge. We open a door to the future, a door to prosperity. We built this with our hands, with our sweat, and with our faith." The crowd roared. They loved him. They didn't see the offshore accounts. They didn't see the rotting drainage pipes under the access road. They only saw the man who had promised them a miracle and delivered it. I looked for Sarah Miller. She wasn't on the dais. She wasn't in the VIP tent with the mayor and the senator. I found her standing in the back of the crowd, near a hot dog cart. She wasn't wearing her hard hat or her gray suit. She was wearing a simple wool coat and a scarf. She looked small. She looked like a civilian. She was watching the first cars cross the bridge, a convoy of vintage convertibles carrying the town council. She wasn't smiling. She was just watching, her eyes tracking the load distribution, calculating the vibration frequency. I walked over to her. "You should be up there," I said. "It's your bridge." Sarah shook her head, not taking her eyes off the structure. "It's not mine anymore," she said quietly. "It belongs to gravity now, and to him." She gestured to Julian, who was cutting the ribbon with giant golden scissors. "He won," I said bitterly. "He stole everything, and he gets the applause." "He didn't win," Sarah said, finally looking at me. "He just survived. There's a difference." 2 weeks later, Sarah resigned. It was a quiet affair. No press release, no farewell party. She sold her share of the firm to Julian for a fraction of its value, a symbolic buyout that cleared her name from the letterhead. She packed her office in a single afternoon. I stopped by to say goodbye. The office was empty. The models were gone. The blueprints were shredded. It was just a room with a view of the river. "Where are you going?" I asked. "West," she said. "Somewhere with less rain. somewhere where the ground is solid. "What about Julian?" I asked. "He's going to ruin this town, Sarah. He's going to take over everything." "Julian is a force of nature," she said, picking up her bag. "You don't fight a hurricane. You build a shelter and you wait for it to pass." She left. She walked out of the building and drove away in her sensible sedan, leaving Oakhaven to the man she had made a king. Before I left, I made one last stop. I went to the main office, which had been renamed the Sloane Center for Infrastructure. Julian was there, drinking champagne with the mayor. He saw me and waved me over. "Elara!" he cried, his face flushed with victory. "You're still here! I thought you'd abandoned us." He walked over, putting a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy. "The offer still stands, Elara. We need a chief financial officer, someone who knows where the bodies are buried and how to keep them there." "I'm not for sale, Julian," I said, stepping back. "Everyone is for sale, Elara. It's just a matter of price." I walked out. I didn't look back. I packed my trailer. I filed my report on the Vista land management discrepancy. I documented the shell companies, the ski lodge, the bribes. I hand-delivered it to the city council clerk. She was a nice woman named Brenda who had a picture of Julian on her wall. She stamped it "Received," smiled at me, and put it in a box marked "Pending." I knew what that meant. It meant the shredder. I drove out of Oakhaven the same way I came in, over the cracked asphalt of the old highway. I passed the "Welcome to Oakhaven" sign. It had been replaced. The old peeling wood was gone. In its place was a shiny backlit sign that read, "Oakhaven, the bridge to tomorrow, a Miller-Sloane community." I looked in my rearview mirror at the bridge. It gleamed in the sunlight, perfect and pure. It was a lie made of concrete. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a crime scene where the body hadn't been found yet. I spent the next 3 years working in Chicago, auditing insurance claims, but I checked the Oakhaven news every week. I watched Julian's rise. I watched him groundbreak the new hospital. I watched him marry a senator's daughter after Elena divorced him. I watched and I waited. I knew the concrete was setting. I knew the rot was spreading. I just didn't know when the ground would finally give way. 3 years later, the grace Julian had shown the town began to rot. I was in Chicago, auditing a medical supply chain, when I got the call. It was Brenda, the city clerk, the nice woman who had stamped my report, "Pending." Her voice was unrecognizable. It was thin, brittle, like dry leaves. "Miss Vance," she said, "we need you. The court appointed you. Can you come back?" "What happened, Brenda?" I asked. "Everything," she whispered. "The ground is opening up." I flew back the next morning. I rented a car at the airport and drove the 30 miles to Oakhaven. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the salt air anymore. It was the smell of stagnant water and wet drywall. The bridge to tomorrow sign was still there, but someone had thrown a bucket of red paint over Julian's name. I drove onto the main access road, the one Pete Russo's crew had built. It was a disaster zone. The asphalt looked like a cracked puzzle. Cones and caution tape were everywhere. I passed a sinkhole the size of a swimming pool that had swallowed a delivery truck. The driver was standing on the side of the road, staring into the abyss, shaking his head. The drainage systems, the ones Julian had promised would hold up the earth, had failed completely. The porous stone Sarah had rejected was crumbling under the salt air, turning into gravel that clogged the pipes. When the spring wains came, the water had nowhere to go. It saturated the soil, turning the ground beneath the roads into soup. Basements were flooded. The new school Julian had promised? Construction had stopped because the foundation was sinking. The town of Oakhaven, which had invested everything in this bypass was suddenly facing a $100 million repair bill for the infrastructure surrounding the bridge. Because Julian had allowed flexible standards to keep people happy, the town was now functionally bankrupt. The bridge to the future had become an anchor, dragging them down. I went looking for Pete Russo. The Rusty Anchor pub was boarded up, a foreclosure notice stapled to the door. I found Pete sitting on the porch of his small house, staring at the rain. He looked 20 years older. His hands, once strong enough to crush stone, were shaking. "They're suing me, Elara," he said, not looking at me. "The city, the insurance companies, they say I was negligent." "You weren't negligent, Pete," I said softly. "You were used." "Does it matter?" he asked. "My crew's out of work. My grandfather's reputation is mud. And the bridge, it's just laughing at us." He pointed to the structure looming in the distance, pristine and untouched by the chaos below. I drove past the high school. I remembered Samantha, the girl who got the scholarship. I stopped and asked the principal about her. He laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "Samantha? She's working at the diner. She never went to Stanford." "But the scholarship," I said. "The Bridge to the Future Fund?" "It was tied to municipal bonds," the principal explained. "When the town's credit rating tanked because of the infrastructure debt, the bonds became worthless. The money evaporated. Julian Sloane gave her a giant cardboard check, but he didn't give her a future." I felt a knot of guilt tighten in my throat. I knew. I had known. 3 years ago. I had walked away. I met the bankruptcy judge in the town hall. The room was cold. The heat had been turned off to save money. The judge was a tired man who had seen too many towns die. "We need to know who is liable," he said, rubbing his temples. "We need to know if we can sue Miller-Sloane." "You can try, but Sarah Miller writes very good contracts." I spent the next week in the records room. It was like performing an autopsy on a city. I went back to the original plans. I pulled every contract, every addendum, every email, and that's when I saw it. That's when I saw what Sarah Miller had truly done. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't negligence. It was architecture. I found a document titled Exhibit C, Jurisdictional Boundaries. It was signed by Sarah, Julian, and the mayor at the time. It defined the bridge as a very specific legal entity. The bridge consisted of the pylons, the cables, and the suspended deck. Everything else, the approach ramps, the drainage, the access roads, was defined as municipal support infrastructure. Sarah had drawn a line in the dirt. On one side was her masterpiece, built to withstand a nuclear blast. On the other side was the town's responsibility, built on handshake deals and wet sand. She ensured that the bridge's financial and physical security was completely decoupled from the town. She knew Julian was corrupt. She knew Pete Russo's crew couldn't handle the drainage specs. She didn't allow Julian to hire them out of weakness. She steered Julian towards those peripheral projects. She gave him the soft work so he would stay away from her steel and her pylons. She used Julian's greed and the town's desire for kindness as a trash bin. She threw all the corruption, all the shoddy workmanship, and all the political favors into the access roads, knowing they would fail. She sacrificed the town's future to ensure that her bridge would remain pristine, a solo monument in a wasteland of Julian's making. I sat back in my chair, staring at her signature. It was elegant, precise, sharp. It was the signature of a woman who had calculated the load-bearing capacity of a human soul and found it wanting. She hadn't just built a bridge. She had built a fortress, and she had pulled up the drawbridge, leaving everyone else to drown in the moat. I spent weeks in the records room, surrounded by dust and the smell of decaying paper. I was looking for a mistake, a loophole,
A place where Sarah Miller had slipped up and allowed liability to bleed onto her firm. But what I found was not a mistake. It was a masterclass. It was the most elegant, ruthless piece of legal engineering I had ever seen. Sarah had written the contracts herself. I could see her syntax in the clauses. Precise, unyielding, cold. She had defined the bridge not as a physical object connected to the land, but as a sovereign entity. In Exhibit C, she laid out the jurisdictional boundaries. The bridge began exactly 1 inch past the abutment joint. Everything before that inch, the approach ramps, the drainage culverts, the retaining walls, the very earth the town stood on, was defined as municipal support infrastructure. It was a line drawn in invisible ink, but it was as impenetrable as a fortress wall. I found Clause 14B, Subsurface Stability Liability. It read, "The municipality assumes full responsibility for all geotechnical variance within the support zone. Miller-Sloane warrants the integrity of the suspended structure only." I realized what this meant. If the ground collapsed, the town's fault. If the roads washed away, the town's fault. Sarah had immunized the bridge from the earth itself. She had ensured that the bridge's financial and physical security was completely decoupled from the town. I remembered a conversation I had with her in the first year. We were standing on the bluff looking at the survey markers. "Boundaries are everything, Elara," she had said. "Without boundaries, the chaos of the world bleeds in." I thought she was talking about property lines. Now I knew she was talking about liability. She knew Julian was corrupt. She had known it since day one. She didn't allow him to hire Pete Russo out of weakness. She didn't let him pay Vista Land Management out of ignorance. She steered him. She guided his greed like a river, channeling it away from her pylons and into the municipal support zone. She gave him the soft work, the roads, the drainage, the landscaping, because she knew he would cut corners. She knew he would steal, and she knew it would fail. She used Julian's greed and the town's desire for kindness as a trash bin. She threw all the corruption, all the shoddy workmanship, and all the political favors into the access roads, knowing they would collapse. She sacrificed the town's future to ensure that her bridge would remain pristine. It was a sacrifice she made without blinking. I called the town's lawyer, a young man named Davis who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I showed him Exhibit C. He read it, his face turning pale. "We can't sue her," he whispered. "She carved us out. We own the dirt. She owns the sky." I said, "She knew. She set Julian up to fail." "It doesn't matter," Davis said, dropping the contract. "It's legal. It's evil, but it's legal." I imagined her sitting in her office, watching Julian charm the town council, watching him hand out bribes, watching him destroy the soil stability. And I imagined her thinking, "Good, keep it over there. Keep the rot away from my pylons." She had weaponized his corruption. She had turned his greed into a containment field. Julian thought he was the king of Oakhaven, but he was just the janitor, mopping up the mess so Sarah could build her cathedral. And when the bill came due, when the ground opened up and the lawsuits started flying, Sarah was gone. She was in Oregon, watching the sunset, while Julian was left holding the bag. He was facing indictment. He was facing bankruptcy. The town he had saved was now ready to lynch him. Sarah had set him up. She had handed him the rope, tied the noose, and waited for him to jump. It was the architect's knife, a clean cut that severed the limb to save the body. The body was the bridge. The limb was Oakhaven. I sat in that cold room, shivering. I had spent my career hunting thieves. I knew how to catch men like Julian. They were simple. They wanted money. They wanted power. But Sarah
Sarah didn't want money. She didn't care about power. She wanted immortality. She wanted to build something that would outlast the people who built it. And if she had to bury a town to do it, well, that was just the cost of materials. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a criminal. I was dealing with a fanatic, a woman who worshipped geometry and despised humanity. And for the first time in my life, I was terrified, not of what she had done, but of how much sense it made. It took me 6 months to find her. Sarah Miller hadn't run. She had simply erased herself. She had moved to a small coastal town in Oregon, a place where the cliffs dropped into the Pacific with violent finality. I found her address in a property tax database. She was living in a house that looked like a glass box suspended over the ocean. I rented a car and drove up the coast. The fog was thick, hugging the road like a wet blanket. It felt like driving to the end of the world. I parked at the bottom of her driveway and walked up. Sarah was sitting on the deck, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. She didn't turn around when I walked up the stairs. "Hello, Elara," she said. Her voice was the same, calm, measured, devoid of fear. "You found me." "It wasn't hard," I said. "You bought the house under your own name." "I have nothing to hide," she said, turning to look at me. She looked older. Her hair was completely gray now, cut short, but her eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, unclouded by guilt. "You have a lot to hide, Sarah," I said, sitting in the chair opposite her. "You destroyed a town." "I built a bridge," she corrected, "and the bridge is standing. I checked the structural sensors this morning. No variance. It is perfect." "And the roads?" I asked. "The school? The people who lost their homes?" "That was Julian," she said, taking a sip of tea. "That was the town. They made a deal. They wanted the bridge, but they didn't want to pay for it, so they paid with their future." "You let them," I said, my voice rising. "You knew Julian was stealing. You knew the infrastructure would fail. You watched it happen." Sarah set her cup down. "I didn't just watch, Elara. I calculated. I knew exactly how much corruption the project could sustain before the bridge itself was compromised. I drew a line. Julian could steal from the roads, from the drainage, from the landscaping, but the moment he touched the pylons, I would have stopped him. But he never did. He knew better." "So you used him," I said. "You used him as a shield." "I used him as a filter," she said. "Julian was the filter for the world's mess. He absorbed the bribes, the politics, the stupidity. He kept it all away from the steal." "He's going to prison, Sarah," I said. "The town is suing him. He's ruined." "He got what he wanted," Sarah said. "For 3 years he was a king. He was loved. He stood on that stage and they cheered for him. That was the transaction. He got the applause. I got the bridge." "And the people?" I asked. "The people who trusted him?" Sarah leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. It wasn't pity. It was contempt. "The people of Oakhaven didn't want the truth, Elara. They wanted Julian. They wanted to be told that their local way was just as good as my engineering specs. If I had fought them, if I had told them that their granite was porous, that their contractor was incompetent, they would have hated me, they would have fired me, and the bridge would never have been built. So I gave them exactly what they asked for. I gave them Julian. I gave them grace. I gave them the stone that was good enough." She sat back, coughing slightly, a deep, wet cough that shook her small frame. I looked at the table next to her tea. There was a bottle of pills, strong ones, painkillers, and an oxygen tank tucked behind her chair. "You're sick," I whispered. Sarah smiled, a thin, wintry smile. "Stage 4, she said. "Pancreatic. I've had it for 5 years." "5 years?" I said, doing the math. "You knew when you started the project?" "I knew I had a deadline," Sarah said. I knew I had one great work left in me. I didn't have time to argue with town councils. I didn't have time to wait for environmental impact studies or wetland permits. I needed speed. I needed Julian. You sacrificed them because you were dying. The horror washed over me. You burned a town to build your headstone. I built something that will last, she whispered, leaning back and closing her eyes. My body is failing, Elara. It's weak, it's flawed. But the bridge is forever. I traded my morality for immortality. It was a fair exchange. I looked at her, dying in her glass box alone with her monument. She had won, but the victory was ash in her mouth. She would die here, listening to the ocean, with no one to hold her hand but the ghost of her own ambition. And Julian? I checked on him a year later. He wasn't in prison. His lawyers, paid for with the last of the embezzled money, had kept him out on a technicality. But he was ruined. He was working as a greeter at a casino in Atlantic City. I saw a photo of him online. He was wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit, smiling that same charming smile at tourists who walked past him without a glance. He was still trying to sell a dream, but no one was buying. He was a king without a kingdom, a charmer without an audience. And Oakhaven? The town survived. They rebuilt the roads, slowly, properly. They raised taxes. They learned the hard lesson that there are no shortcuts. They learned that if you want a bridge that stands, you have to build it on truth, not on charm. "You're a monster, Sarah," I whispered to the dying woman. "No," she said, her voice barely a breath. "I'm an architect, and in 100 years when Julian is forgotten and I am dust, my bridge will still be there. That is the only truth that matters." I stood up and walked away. I drove back down the coast, leaving her to her view. I realized then that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the gun, it's the one with the clock. Sarah Miller let the world burn because she ran out of time, and Julian Sloane burned with him because he thought he had all the time in the world. And that, in the end, was the only justice there was.
We have reached the end of the Miller-Sloane account. The files are closed. The invoices are filed. The bridge stands, and the town survives. But the story isn't really about concrete or steel or embezzlement. It never was. As I sit here in my office, listening to the rain against the glass, I am struck by the silence that follows a case like this. It's a heavy silence. It's the sound of illusions shattering. Before I leave you with the final lesson, I want to hear from you. Please comment below with your reflections. Have you ever been the scaffolding for someone else's monument? Have you ever realized, too late, that someone's integrity was only a shield for their own ego? And for the last time, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It is how we keep the ledger balanced. The lesson is this, and it is a bitter one. The most profound betrayal is not performed by those who hate us, but by those who are indifferent to us in the pursuit of their own excellence. We are taught to trust the principled person. We are taught that the person who never breaks a rule is the safest pair of hands. We look for the Sarah Millers of the world, the experts, the geniuses, the ones with the vision. We think their competence is a form of morality, but it isn't. Competence is just a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build a shelter or a cage. Sarah Miller was the most competent person I have ever met. She followed every rule of engineering to the letter. She respected the physics of tension and compression more than she respected the laws of men. And in doing so, she presided over the ruin of 3,000 people because they weren't as perfect as the bridge she wanted to leave behind. She viewed them as rounding errors, as friction. And then there are the Julian Sloanes, the charmers, the ones who make us feel seen. We know, deep down, that they are lying to us. We know the math doesn't add up, but we forgive them because they offer us a better story about ourselves.
Julian told Oakhaven they were special. He told them they were heroes, and for 3 years, they loved him for it. They chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. We all do this. We all want the soft answer. We want the doctor who tells us we're fine, not the one who tells us to change our diet. We want the politician who promises us the moon, not the one who explains the budget deficit. We are complicit in our own deception. This is the hard truth of the forensic auditor. The crime is rarely a solo act. The thief needs a willing victim. The con artist needs a mark who wants to believe. Oakhaven wasn't just a victim of Julian's greed or Sarah's ambition. It was a victim of its own vanity. Trust the person who can admit they are flawed. Be wary of the person whose only God is their own work. Because when the world ends, they won't be looking for survivors. They'll just be checking the tension on the cables. They will be measuring the angle of the fall to make sure it aligns with their calculations. As I close this file, I want you to look at your own life. Who is your Julian? Who is the person selling you a dream that feels too good to be true? And who is your Sarah? Who is the person building a monument to themselves on your back? Find them, and when you do, don't wait for the ground to open up. Don't wait for the audit. Walk away, because the bridge might stand for 100 years, but you don't have to be the one buried in its shadow. My name is Elara Vance. This has been The Calculus of Conviction. Thank you for listening.